Let's now talk about REST and Firebase. How to do REST with Firebase. One thing to bear in mind is that the Angular Fire client and the SDK as well, they are isomorphic, meaning that they will work in both the browser and a Node.js process. There are also versions of the SDK in many languages. It's available for Android, etc. So you could easily build a REST API that calls Firebase. Another alternative is to use the REST capabilities of Firebase itself. In Firebase, everything is REST enabled out of the box, so every lesson, every course, we can do REST calls to operate on this data. Let's take, for example, this course, Angular 2 Tutorial for Beginners. It's actually a lesson. So this is the first lesson of the first course, Angular 2 Tutorial for Beginners. Let's copy this URL. Here is the URL. So it takes the database. So this is the URL to the root of our database, then /lessons, and then the ID of the lesson. With Firebase, if we take this URL and we do a get call to it, we are going to get this data. So this is already implemented for us. We don't need to implement a REST API that it's going to read Firebase and get this lesson and then return it to us. We can call Firebase directly using an HTTP GET and retrieve this lesson data. Let's do that here using a test client. We are going to do a GET call. To this path, we need to add .json at the end. So as you can see, when we run the GET method in this host to this path using .json at the end, we get back the data of this lesson as expected. Because it's a GET request, you can also do this directly from the browser. So if you copy paste the path itself without the .json, you are going to be redirected to the Firebase console. So here you can see your data in the Firebase console, but if you add a .json at the end, take a look at what you receive. You receive the plain raw JSON data. So in this example, we did an HTTP GET to retrieve the data from Firebase directly, but other methods are available. So if we switch back to our test client, we can do, for example, also a post to create a new lesson. We can do a put to replace the whole content of the lesson, a patch to replace certain properties, and delete to delete the lesson. In this case, we are going to do a patch. So let's say that we hit this URL with a patch request. We are going to set here the body of the patch request, and we are going to pass in here some JSON. We are going to modify only the description property. So patch allows us to modify only certain properties. We don't have to pass in the whole list of properties. So we are going to set the description property to test. If we now run this and take a look here at this description field, the description field was updated to test as expected. So this means that all modification operations in our database could be done using also the Angular 2 HTTP library. So let's add it here to our program. We can simply add here the HTTP module, and with this we have all the HTTP injectables ready to use. What we're going to do is, to show that this is a possibility, we are going to implement the logic to delete a lesson using the HTTP module. In general, the Angular Fire library is a better solution for accessing Firebase because the observable-based API is really a great match to the real-time capabilities of the database. But everything in Firebase is doable also via REST, and that's what we're going to illustrate here. In order to implement the delete lesson logic, we are going to switch over to the lesson detail HTML template, and we're going to add here a click handler to the delete button. Now let's switch over to the lesson detail component and let's implement the delete method. So the delete method is going to delete the current lesson. For this, we are going to do a call to the lesson service, and we are going to call delete lesson, which is a new method that we are about to implement. And we are going to pass it in the identifier of the current lesson. So let's implement delete lesson in lesson service. So this is the signature of the delete lesson method. We're going to implement delete lesson not using the Angular Fire API, but instead we are going to do a REST call, as we mentioned. We have injected here in the constructor of lesson service, we have injected Angular to HTTP. So how can we use it to do an HTTP delete? What we want to do here is we want to call the HTTP delete method. So using this.http, we have here a call to delete, and we want to pass in here a URL that we are going to build here. So I am just going to initialize it for the moment like this. Now, what is this URL? Remember, we have here a Firebase config, and the Firebase config contains here your main database URL. So let's base ourselves on that. We're going to do Firebase config.database URL, and we are going to add a slash, and we are going to add here /lessons, and we are going to concatenate the lesson ID. So this is the URL that we want to hit with the delete request. Now, like other API methods of lesson service, it's a good idea to return here an observable. So in this case, we will simply do an observable of any, and we are going to return the result of calling delete. So if there is an error calling delete, like it's not authorized, this is going to trigger an error in this observable here. Let's now try to delete a lesson. So I have switched over to this view so that we can see at the same time the application and the database. We're going to delete this lesson, the build your first Angular 2 component, which is this one over here. Remember, you need to be authenticated at this stage of the application development in order to access this screen. So let's just delete the lesson and see what happens. As you can see, nothing has happened, and this happens very often, developing using observables. This is because we called this method and we get back an observable, but we did not subscribe to it. So that ended up not triggering the HTTP call. So what we need to do is we need to subscribe to this observable. And what we're going to do here is, if there is a deletion successful, we are going to show an alert to the user, lesson deleted. Otherwise, and in this particular case, we are simply going to log the error to the console. We also need to add to the URL the .json extension. Let's now try to delete the lesson. So we are going to try to delete build your first Angular 2 component, which corresponds to this lesson right here. So if we click delete, we can see that the lesson was deleted, so it's gone here from the list of lessons, and we have seen the pop-up saying lesson deleted. As we can see, the Firebase REST API allows us to do the most common data operations that we typically use with REST. So all the operations of adding to a list, removing from a list, updating an element, patching it, etc. All of that is available out of the box with Firebase.